Musing with Dr. Michael Leach, Part 2, part of the series Musing with seasoned mediator trainer Dr. Barbara Manousso. That is our topic for today. Welcome to the Lawyers and Mediators International Show and Podcast by InstantMediations.com, where we discuss law and conflict resolution topics to educate both professionals and everyday people. Catch regular episodes on YouTube, the Instant Mediations app, and anywhere you get your podcasts. Just remember, nothing in these episodes constitutes legal advice, so be sure to talk to a lawyer, as cases are fact-dependent. Hey everyone, this is attorney Mac, pierre-louis, lawyer, mediator, arbitrator, working throughout Florida and Texas.
And Natalia Łowska-Czajka, advocate, mediator, and arbitrator from Warsaw, Poland, this time speaking from Venice, Italy.
And I'm Dr. Barbara Manousso, and I am in Rhode Island as well as Texas, and our reach is worldwide. And I am just delighted today to be able to introduce Dr. Michael Leach. And Dr. Leach is in Ohio, and he is a clinical psychologist and a clinical forensic psychologist. He is also a mediator, and we invited him here today to help families who might be going through divorce and who will benefit from finding out resources that might help them as they negotiate and they try to make plans in the best interest of their children. And since Dr. Leach is a mediator as well as psychologist, he doesn't do both services at the same time. He's either a mediator or he's a clinical psychologist or an evaluator. So Dr. Leach, you've done this over 30 years. You're well regarded in the community. You've spoken at many international conferences. This is an opportunity to talk directly to parents who are going through a divorce and who might want to know what type of resources, or if they're court ordered, if they have attorneys. Some people come pro se without attorneys, and so they might not even be as aware of resources available. But for those who are even court appointed and the court appoints an evaluator or an ad litem, could you give some explanation of what those roles are, how they differ, how they can help a family, and maybe give a few examples of clients that you've worked with where it's been quite an advantage for them to access these resources and understand what they can expect from these resources. I think that's the most important part.
Okay. So, I was just thinking as you started this introduction, one of the things that I'm going through right now, I have a family where one of the family members, the father, in fact, has been diagnosed with a bipolar type 2 condition. And when we hear bipolar, we hear manic, depressive, crazy, loony. The guy goes out and buys 2 grand pianos and charges it to the family account. That isn't a bipolar type 2, actually. A bipolar type 2 person is somebody who can get depressed and doesn't respond awfully well to the standard treatments for depression. So the question became, what do we do? Do we have to make some kind of changes in the parenting plan because of this person's needs, because of this parent's needs? Will the children be safe? And those are questions that, I put on my clinical hat, and I can give the mediator some good information about what they can expect for this parent in terms of the parenting capacity, in terms of what kinds of things might have to be a little bit different in this case. And in terms of a backup plan in case things go off the rails. In this particular case, they're not going to go off the rails. He's very stable. And the fact that he has this diagnosis shouldn't impact at all with his capacity to parent, which is, reassuring not only to him, but reassuring to his soon-to-be ex-wife who wants to make sure that the kids are well taken care of.
Dr. Leach, just as a follow-up from my introduction kind of to your services, could you give a definition of what an evaluation looks like? What do people expect? Who's being evaluated? How many times? Where does this happen? What's the framework look like for an evaluator? What would a family expect if somebody says evaluator? You say, "Wow, is somebody going to come into my home and sit there for the next year and look at everything I do? And every time I blow my nose or have an argument over the fence, is that going to be a demerit? Or my kid's going to be taken away to CPS?" These are the things I think people are worried about. So what does it look like? Who's being evaluated? How many times? Where do you meet? What does the session look like?
Well, generally, the
For the
way
service.
and we have different ideas about how to do a good evaluation, but they all have the same basis, and that is the evaluator needs to meet with both parents, either separately or together, to get an idea of their interaction and to get an idea of their interaction with their children. So the evaluator needs to meet with the children, with each parent separately, because it always amazes me after doing this for over 30 years how different a child will be when they're in the company of one parent versus in the company of the other parent. Just last week, I had a couple of evaluations. I scheduled them back to back, so they came in for 45 minutes each. Most kids around the age of 10 or less can't tolerate more than 45 minutes in this office setting. And with Mom, these kids were respectful, they were courteous, they were pretty quiet, but extremely well behaved. With Dad, these same kids were raucous. They were full of fun. They were playing jokes on Dad. And we saw two sides of the same kids in that experience. So part of the evaluation is looking at the kids and how they interact with their parents. A good part of the evaluation is me talking to people who are neutral, who are going to give me information about these parents and kids. I don't want to talk to your brother-in-law because your brother-in-law is only going to have nice things to say. But I do want to talk to the coach who might have seen an incident that happened between the two parents that I need to be able to make some sense of. I'm also going to want to talk to teachers who might be quite neutral. I talk at times with doctors, particularly with kids that have special needs. Most of the time I don't talk to doctors because they're just way too busy to have these talks. And I do talk to therapists and counselors who have seen the children, counselors who have seen the parents. And when I do that, I make sure that the first thing that I say to the counselor is that I want to make sure that you keep what needs to be private, private. I'm interested in looking at the quality of the relationship between each parent and the child, and I don't want to go up into other details that might hurt your private relationship with your clients. So that's important. We wrap all these things up. We bring all these things together. How long does it take? I usually take 2 or 3 hours with each parent. I usually take 2 or 3 hours with each kid, with each parent. I personally rarely do home visits, but some people do. I had a case many years ago where a father filed a complaint against me because I didn't see the value that his 6,500 square foot house was more valuable to the children than her smaller home. He felt that that was the most important thing that he had to offer. And maybe it was, but I didn't go out there to the house and look at that. So most of my meetings are in the office. Sometimes I'll do psychological testing, particularly when there's questions of somebody overusing alcohol, overusing drugs, or having a mental disorder, which sometimes happens in these evaluations. So,
Dr. Leach, following on that, I wanted to ask you, we live in a world which we all know, and there is more and more charges, or actually at least complaints from parents, one parent against another, about the possibility of child abuse or some sort of sexual disorder that either men or women claim against one another, which can be, or according to them, might be detrimental to the child. Do you evaluate that? And do you work with situations of this kind?
we have to. It's part of a competent evaluation, and if I don't look into those kinds of complaints, I'm not worth much. What I see more than the outright complaints of sexual molestation or child abuse is I see signs of parents doing things they shouldn't be doing in the process of the divorce with their children. Saying to their children, your dad is all about money. That's the only thing he cares about. It's his only interest. Saying to the children, your mom's probably got a boyfriend by now. Tell me about that. These things shouldn't be part of the divorce process, but they are. And I see a lot of that. The other kind of abuse that we look at is we look at spousal abuse. And I need to make a evaluation of that because, as mediators, there are some cases that cannot and should not be mediated when there is significant abuse, or when there is a significant difference in the power dynamics between one parent and the other. There are parents that are more savvy about money than other parents, but that can be fixed in a good mediation. What can't be fixed is when somebody is terrorized. They can't go into mediation and mediate away their own interests. That isn't fair to them. And so, yes, part of the psychological evaluation is to look at and see if there's that kind of abuse. But, for the most part, what I see, and I've said it so many times over the course of the years, I see good people at their worst. I see people who, I don't know of people that don't behave badly at the beginning of the divorce. It's just part of the process. And unfortunately, what that means is that the other parent who hears about some of these things or saw some of the things that happened early on, they keep it in their mind. They forget that what happened 3 months ago may never happen again.
Dr. Leach, one of the things that I think people might want to hear about or know about, again, as an evaluator, how is this handled financially? What would a divorcing couple be looking at to have this service provided for them? And then what's the difference between an evaluator and an ad litem? And who else might be at the table that might be part of a support resource team that the mediator should know about? And where is the definition or the line of demarcation between the mediator and the different resources? Because the mediator could get will get the reports of these resources, whether it's an evaluator, an ad litem. They're more for a court, but how does that differ between just a judge looking at this information versus information a mediator needs to be empowered with as they go forth with their negotiation, so that they can be sure that they're being neutral and they are mindful of information of their clients what they are negotiating about. I think that's one of the most difficult and tricky opportunities for a mediator, to know what's important to them, what's not important to them, how much does this intrude on the negotiation process, because a mediator doesn't want to end up with a bowl that has a hole in the bottom.
Right.
Nor would a divorce. That's when people keep going back to court, and nobody wants to see the judge doesn't want to see them so many times.
So you get 15 questions here, and I'll
that-
try to answer about 2 of them. Uh, because this is a huge topic. First of all,
Yes.
private evaluations are very costly. The average, I think, in America is now somewhere above $14,000 for a private evaluation.
Mhm.
And that often doesn't include time in providing testimony in court, which is also expensive.
If it goes to court, yeah.
If it
And
goes
it
to-
doesn't always go to court, but it's,
Oh, most of them don't. 95% of cases in my area get settled in some way. Not necessarily in a good way, but they get settled in some way. The goal of a good mediation, and the goal of all of us, I think, is to come up with a way of getting people to take control of their own lives, rather than having some court or some foreigner or some mediator or some psychologist tell them what to do.
right.
And to be able to continue that control because they've learned how to behave post-divorce. So what's the difference between a psychologist and a guardian ad litem? Oh, and by the way, there are services in many courts to provide psychological services for much less. In my county, you can get a competent psychological evaluation by a evaluator at the county for $300 for the family. So 300 versus 14 or 15,000, there's a big difference.
So this is something that one of the husband or wife might say, I want my spouse to be evaluated. Is that because they are a secret drug addict, and I need to know this, and the court needs to know this, and I can't have my kids at his house while he's stoned every weekend.
That's how it comes in. But you know what?
Point as a parent.
If the spouse gets evaluated, you're going to get evaluated too.
Okay.
And so is your relationship with your children. And so is the extent to which you've told the children all these bad things about your spouse. And yeah, I mean, there are cases in which, a parent, I remember a case where the father would show up drunk for his parent time access. And the question the mom always had was, well, do I withhold the children? She decided what to do. She said to him, come back in an hour and you can see the children. Don't come back and we'll just schedule it for another time. That's how she did it. It wasn't necessarily the way the court papers told her to do it, because the court papers don't necessarily know what to do in those kinds of circumstances, but that's how she handled it. The typical thing we do in this area is we say, you know what, if somebody doesn't show up for their access period, give them 30 minutes or so. We're in an area where there's a lot of snow at times. Give them 30 minutes to be late, but after that 30 minutes, you have no requirement to wait. All right. I do want to talk about therapists, because I think therapists can be awfully helpful to the mediation process. I think therapists train parents in how to behave in the course of a divorce and how to feel like they're normal during the course of the divorce. So therapists for parents is a really good thing. And for parents who want to take advantage of it, they find that the mediation goes quicker, because they get a better sense of what really are their values, what's really important to them. We all start out saying, what do I want? And I've got lots of people that come into the office and say, I want a 50-50 plan, whatever that 50-50 is. Well, if your households are such that one home is 40 minutes away from the child's school and the other home is 5 minutes away from the child's school, do you want a 50-50 plan? And if you do, how are you going to configure it in a way that's not going to put the child in a bad situation? I actually did a case in California where the child spent half time in Los Angeles and half time in San Francisco with two very upscale parents who insisted that this is what they needed. But they needed it for themselves, not for the children. And so one of the things that therapists do really well is to help parents start looking at the needs of their children during this process when they feel so resourceless that they find that they can hardly look at their own needs, but they can advance to looking at the needs of their children because they're in good treatment. Treatment for children. This is very useful in this course because children are under enormous stress. Why? Because of the unknown.
Sure.
The worst thing in the world for a child is to not know what's going to happen tomorrow. Stability is terribly important. So getting a child into good therapy, and good therapy means a therapist that's not going to take the position of one parent or the other. A good therapist is going to work for the child and not for the parent's needs. And a good therapist ought to be willing to communicate with both parents. If you got a therapist that only talks to parent A, you don't have a good therapist.
Dr. Leach, that's a very good point that you're closing on. And Mac, I know you had a question.
So, real quick, and I know we may have to go a couple of minutes over because there's so much we could talk
That's
to
all
you
right.
for a long time. One, how much grief do you get whenever you're doing these kind of things? Because whether you're an evaluator or a mediator or a therapist, you're supposed to be relatively neutral, especially if you're a mediator, okay, when you're dealing with a child custody issue. And I can only imagine, um, being in a situation where most likely in the outcome, one party is not going to like you very much, especially if you come down against them as when you recommend that parent X gets the child primarily for custody purposes. So how do you deal with that, at a personal level? And what would you say to the people out there in the public, and how they come at you whenever they come down on you?
So you have to have a kind of thick skin to do this. As an evaluator, I go into court and I testify. And I used to testify a lot in juvenile court, and there used to be one lawyer that worked for Protective Services. And we would joke because we would go from courtroom to courtroom, and I would say, am I the piece of crap in this courtroom or am I the great Leach? Which one do you want me for, depending upon how you're going to be handling the case. We have to roll with those punches. We have to expect that if we're going to do a good job, an honest job, and a neutral job, that there are times we're going to be telling people things they don't want to hear. And they're not going to like us. And we're not in business to be loved. We are in business, and I think this is true of the psychologists that I know, the lawyers that I know, the ones that last in the practice of domestic relations law, that we all have a similar kind of view, which is we're there to get the best outcome. That's the goal.
That's a wonderful closing. And on that, Dr. Leach, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom, your years of experience. And I'm sure it'll be helpful for people to understand the resources that are available to them when they're going through a divorce, the family's going through a divorce. And as you reiterated many times, it is and should be in the best interest of the children. So thank you very much, Dr. Leach. And of course, Mac and Natalia, thank you.
Okay, until next time.
Until
Bye.
next time.